Experts are warning there's a tenfold increased risk of death from coronavirus for obese people.
Meanwhile, authorities in France have limited the sales of nicotine-based products after a French study suggested smokers may be less susceptible to the virus. Well, we're joined now from Manchester by cardiologist Dr. Aseem Malhotra, who says there is a clear link between COVID-19 and obesity. And from Edinburgh, we are joined by behavioural scientist Professor Linda Bauld, who welcomes the French research, but wants us all to get the message right around it. And Dr. Hilary, of course, joins us as well. Dr. Aseem Malhotra, let's begin with you. What is the link between obesity and COVID-19?
Good morning, Susanna. Well, I think this is really the elephant in the room. So the Centers for Disease Control a few weeks ago did an analysis, and they put out the message that there is likely a tenfold increased risk of mortality, death rates from people who have conditions associated with obesity, which basically include type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease. And this is really a real problem because it's not being addressed and it's not being tackled head on. Now, the reasons for this are twofold. One is excess body fat seems to have an adverse effect when it comes to viral illnesses. We know that from the flu, you're more likely to get severe illness if you're overweight. But with COVID-19, it seems to also drive an excessive immune response called the ARDS, or the acute respiratory distress syndrome, that unfortunately causes many people to die. But this goes well beyond obesity, Susanna, because actually what's underlying this is something called the metabolic syndrome. And to put this in perspective, only 1 in 8 people in the US, and our figures are likely similar in the UK because more than 60% of our population are overweight or obese, are actually metabolically healthy. Now, when you look at the roots of all of this, even pre-COVID-19, it's well established that poor diet now is responsible for 11 million deaths per year, and poor diet is also poor diet causes more disease and death than physical inactivity, smoking, and alcohol combined.
Can I just establish what is our definition of obesity?
Well, it comes from a body mass index of over 30.
And how many people do we have here in the UK who have a BMI over 30?
Yeah, it's about 25%, but it actually also applies to people who are overweight as well, which obviously takes in many more people who have excess body fat, Susanna, and that's the issue. I mean, the other thing that I highlighted as well in an article I wrote in the Telegraph newspaper yesterday is that this is really a food environment problem. This is not one of personal responsibility. So even our hospitals, for example, have become a branding opportunity for the junk food industry. 75% of food purchased in hospitals is unhealthy. And it's no surprise then that more than 50% of NHS employees are overweight or obese, and a quarter of nurses. So
I understand, and I understand you have an issue with the food environment, but I'm just wondering, you know, if viewers are watching this, because you say it's not necessarily about personal responsibility, but from what you're saying, I can imagine people might start thinking, actually, is there something that I can do individually in order to decrease my risk? Is it as directly linked as that?
Yeah, Susanna, you're absolutely right. And I think that's a really important message we need to get out there. So data that's been well established, what I see with my own patients, is that you can reverse these risk factors for metabolic syndrome, even people sending their type 2 diabetes into remission within a few weeks. And I think that message needs to really get across there. We have, you've had on your show before, Tom Watson, as you know, former deputy leader of the Labour Party. I even had a very long chat with yesterday about this whole issue. And he managed, just from cutting out the ultra-processed food, cutting out the junk, eating real nutritious food, was able to reverse his type 2 diabetes and lose 100 pounds in 1 year. Now, on that note, Susanna, I think it's worth mentioning that, it was obviously very concerning for the whole nation to see our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, get admitted to hospital with COVID-19. Now, it's an observation, but it does fit with the evidence that Boris, unfortunately, is significantly overweight. I used to speak to one of his very senior advisors when he was London mayor a few years ago, who expressed to me personally concerns about his weight. So now, people with obesity actually also seem to spread the virus for a much longer period of time and clearly get sicker. If you noticed, Chris Whitty, Matt Hancock, other members of the cabinet who got the virus did not get afflicted as badly, and they are essentially pretty slim. They are not. They don't seem to be affected by overweight issues. So I think it's important to highlight.
Hang on, but Matt Hancock did. I mean, a number of them have had the virus, haven't they? I mean, Dr. Hillary, I think most people looking at the Prime Minister would think, well, he's actually a pretty average-looking kind of guy.
He's pretty average for the rest of the population. The rest of the population, if you take into account overweight people as well as obese people, you're talking about 68% of the population. Now, a figure has been bandied about that 75% of people with CV coronavirus in intensive care are overweight or obese, but then 68% of the population are overweight or obese. So comparing the two, it does seem that there is a relationship between obesity and severe consequences of coronavirus. But we've known for a long time, haven't we, that obesity causes all sorts of medical complications. And our doctor there is right in what he says.
OK, let's bring in Professor Bald. A while ago, I think it was about a week ago, we had the artist, David Hockney, floating an idea, he wrote to a newspaper, floating an idea that smokers might be more resilient to the virus, and everybody mocked him and ridiculed him and so on. Then a French study came out which actually suggested there might be some merit to it. And there's been such a reaction in France, they've actually tried to stop nicotine and cigarettes being sold in case people all start racing out to smoke themselves to try and cure it. What is the reality about this? What do we know about any link with nicotine being a protective shield?
Sure. So it appears, as I was saying to the Financial Times earlier this week, there's something weird going on with smoking and coronavirus. So, as I'm sure Dr. Hillary will confirm, we know for decades that smoking is linked to a higher risk of developing respiratory conditions, and also people who smoke have poorer outcomes. And we've still got about 7 million smokers in the UK, leading preventable cause of death. However, my colleagues at UCL have done what we call a rapid living review of all the studies we have so far on COVID. 28 studies. And what they found is that there are surprisingly few smokers in those studies from China, the USA, France, South Korea, other countries who developed coronavirus. In one French study, 4 times as many non-smokers got the virus and developed COVID-19 compared to smokers. So there's something strange going on, and there is a potential biological explanation for this. The way that the virus enters the body through the epithelial cells comes into contact with what we call the ACE2 receptor, and that is regulated. It responds to nicotine. So it's plausible that smokers are less likely to develop the condition, potentially because of nicotine, which is what the French researchers are doing. But importantly, in that same UCL review, where smokers did develop COVID-19, their outcomes were far worse, particularly when they...
OK, so that's the sting in the tail, isn't it, Hillary? I mean, it's a very interesting set of circumstances here. You would never think that smoking could be good for anything. But here we are with apparent evidence that suggests there's a possibility, however tenuous, that nicotine might be some kind of shield. And yet, if you do get the virus as a smoker, then it can make things a lot worse for you. So obviously we're not encouraging anybody to smoke, but what do you make of this?
Well, it's interesting that the first association came out of China. They noticed that the people admitted to hospitals there with coronavirus there were far fewer smokers than exist in the general population. They thought, well, that's very interesting because damaged lungs, people with damaged lungs are more likely to develop severe consequences of the virus. Then they saw the same sort of thing happening in France. The people admitted, and those people who were recovering, they were still a lower number than the smokers in the general population. So they thought about why this could be, and Professor Linda there was quite right in saying that it could be nicotine in the cigarette smoke that has an effect on the ACE2 receptors. So in France, they're going to do a trial. It hasn't yet got ethical approval. They're going to do a trial on healthcare professionals on the front line and in patients to see whether nicotine patches, not smoking. No one is saying that people should smoke because the dangers of smoking outweigh any possible protection from the nicotine itself. But there is a potential reason why nicotine could be helpful. And in France, they've banned the sale of gum and patches with nicotine because they want to preserve it just in case it does prove to be a useful...
And once again, I mean, the key thing here, because we've had, President Trump causing mayhem by flying kites about all sorts of mad theories. The bottom line, isn't it, Hillary? We've got to wait for these to go through the proper tests and research and for governments to actually assert that these are a good thing to be doing before anybody takes it upon themselves to do something off their own bat.
Absolutely. Look at all the excitement there was about hydroxychloroquine in the early stages. Everybody is trumping it as the thing to prevent the infection. And all the studies that have been done, absolutely no benefit and lots of toxic reactions.
OK,
so it's absolutely right that we do the trials and wait for the results before anybody acts differently.
OK, and that's really interesting. And, of course, Professor Bald has already said, you know, we've got to get the messaging absolutely right when you're dealing with something like nicotine or cigarettes. But listening to Dr Malhotra, Dr Hillary, do you think people should be doing something, for instance, about their diet or their BMI at this stage?
At any stage, it seems absolutely right. At any stage, we should be trying to tackle the problem of obesity, which is an epidemic in itself in this country. And we do encourage the sale of the wrong foods in hospitals, and we do have healthcare professionals too who are overweight. So we need to set good examples. We need to eat nutritious foods which are not high-density calories. And we will protect our population from heart disease and diabetes and metabolic syndrome and all these things, including a resistance to nasty viruses like coronavirus.
OK, Hillary, thank you very much indeed to Dr Malhotra and Professor Ball. We both very grateful to you as well for joining us. Very interesting discussion about the health impact there.